What's official? We have an updated Necromancer build after the patch that is insanely nutty. Can do 4 billion damage, run 120 plus pits, and just destroy everything. And from what I've seen, this build is super fun to play. The stuff for this build was sent to me by Necro, so make sure to check out in the description his YouTube channel, as well as his original Wowhead build planner. And if you guys follow any of my builds at Mobalytics, I've also built it over there in case you want to look at it over there, but his guide is extremely detailed. Now again, the updates for this Necromancer build include a couple things that I'm going to go over, but essentially this build allows us to continue to nuke massive groups of enemies at once, starting to hit into the upper 4, almost 5 billion range with not even perfect gear. That being said, we're going to go over everything. Check those links in the description if you haven't already. The first thing we're going to do is go over the skill tree. So again, make sure to check out those links in the description for both build planners. Now we're going to disregard the initial skill. We're just going to take 2 sets of reap because we just need the points to proceed. Next, we'll take the unliving energy passive to increase our maximum essence. And then we'll also come up here and take imperfectly balanced. So our core skills cost more essence, but deal double basically the damage in terms of the essence that we give up. And we'll make up for the essence cost later in the build. Then we also want 1 out of 3 for hued flesh. So on lucky hit, our damage has up to a chance to create a corpse. And then blood mist for 1 out of 5 being our primary way to immediately generate a corpse and kind of get out of danger. Then you want to take this into enhanced blood mist and ghastly blood mist as well. So we again leave behind that corpse so we can use for our tendrils. We want to take 3 out of 3 for the skeletal warrior masteries. So we increase the damage of our skeletal warriors. And then here we want to take 1 out of 5 for bone prism. A bone prism here actually gives us some unique things. This creates a bone prism around a group of enemies. And if an enemy is actually trapped by that bone prism, you gain 25 essence plus an additional 5 per enemy trapped. Also, enemies inside that bone prison when cast are actually made vulnerable, allowing us to nuke big groups of enemies because of their vulnerable status. We basically swap out Bone Prison for Bone Storm because we don't need the additional DR. Bone Prison actually counts as 5 minions, meaning you actually get 75 essence by default when you cast it, relieving a lot of our essence problems with the rest of our gear, as well as getting an extra damage multiplier. Again, we don't need the Bone Storm DR and crit chance, because essentially the build lets us function on 50% crit chance, but with Bone Prism and some other skills allows us to essentially hit 100% crit chance at 50% crit chance on our actual character. Again, taking Enhanced Bone Prison and Ghastly Bone Prison. Then we want to take the Grim Harvest passive to get a little extra generation for our essence and Fueled by Death to have an easy way to constantly increase our damage after consuming a corpse. And then we want Death's Embrace so we get more damage and more DR, and Death's Approach so we gain movement speed. We also want Amplified Damage so we get increased damage to cursed enemies, as well as Decrepify so again we can slow those enemies and allow them to deal less damage. Now the modifier is when we actually take Enhanced Decrepify, and then also for Abhorrent Decrepify. Unlucky hit, this can help us reduce our cooldowns dramatically. And as you continue to cast Decrepify on a big group of enemies, this allows us to reduce all of our cooldowns from here to almost instantly reduce, so that way we have practically no cooldowns in some cases. We also want to take 1 out of 5 for Corpse Tendrils to bring in all of our enemies around. And keep in mind, Corpse Tendrils also slows enemies by 50% and also makes enemies vulnerable. We also want 3 out of 3 for Necrotic Carapace. So actually when a corpse is formed, you actually get fortified for 6% of your max life. And since we'll be non-stop summoning through corpses, we'll keep max fortify this way. Now here you want to take Bone Spirit. Again, you can see we have 25 ranks out of 5 ranks, which is really going to up this quite a bit, which is the biggest part of this build. So the big thing here with Bone Spirit being a big damage ability, you can see it's going to consume essence and conjure a Bone Spirit, and then it's going to go to enemies and essentially explode. You can also see we get increased damage by 4% for each point of essence spent casting Bone Spirit. Now again, this is going to be our big damage dealer. We'll take that into Enhanced Bone Spirit so that if Bone Spirit critically strikes, its cooldown is reduced by 7 seconds. And keep in mind, we're also getting cooldown reductions for this possibly by Decrepify. And then also we want Dreadful Bone Spirit. So after Bone Spirit hits an enemy, you generate 30% of your maximum essence over the next 4 seconds. Again, helps with our essence regeneration because this build requires a lot of it. But if you can stack it out, it really pays off in the amount of damage we do. Then we want Serrations. So your bone skills actually have an increased critical strike chance for each 30% essence you have upon cast. 3 out of 3 for Rapid Ossification, so every 100 essence you spend reduces the cooldowns of your bone skills by 1.5 seconds. And then Avulsion, so your bone skills deal 15% increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Then we want Inspiring Leader, so you get increased critical strike chance and our key passive Ossified Essence, so your bone skills deal increased damage for each point of essence you have above 50 upon cast. Again, helping us to stack massive Bone Spirit damage. So next I want to touch on the gear. Now, one of the primary things you need to know about this build is it is very essence hungry. So you want to make sure you have a maximum resource and essence per second on most of these gear pieces I'm going to show you, because you need to be generating as much essence as possible, not only to keep it up for casting, but again to regenerate it so we can cast multiple times repeatedly off of our cooldowns, and also maintain those maximum damage buffs from having enough essence. Then also we do want maximum resource as well, again to stack more essence, and the more essence we have, the more multiplicative damage we're doing with some of our other skills. So for our helmet, we want a couple of things. Again, we want maximum essence and essence per second. Again, a big focus on essence per second so we can keep that maxed out, and you don't have to have essence problems, but again, that maximum resource is something you're going to want to look out for as well. And then armor here on our helmet, as well as armor tempered, should take care of all of your remaining armor requirements that you shouldn't now have to worry about. Also, we want to take lucky hit up to a 23% chance to stun for 2 seconds, but ideally, again, maximum resource is what you're going to want to focus your masterworking on to increase that and increase our overall damage. Then you want to also take the blood getters aspect here, so your skeletal priests are now empowered. Next is our chest. We want to take max life, essence per second again, and +5 to macabre skills. Again, not only are we going to get a +5 to all macabre skills, but again, we're getting that +5 to bone spirit, allowing us to do more big damage hits. This is a big increase, and so you want to make sure you have that, and you want to make sure you have it masterworked as well, so that way if you masterwork it and hit it enough times, you can get up to at least a +5 for double tapping this with your masterworking if you're lucky, as well as having it GA'd on your chest. Now we also want to take maximum life here for a temper and corpse tendril size, and then for our aspect, we want the aspect of hardened bones, so you and your minions gain that increased damage reduction. Next, for our gloves, we want a couple things: intelligence for extra skill damage, critical strike chance, masterworked if possible, so we can hit that 50% total crit strike chance, and then +5 to core skills. Now our Bone Spirit is going to be a core skill technically by its tag, so this is going to again upgrade that into even more damage. Now we also want Bone Spirit damage as our main damage dealer, obviously tempered on our gloves, and then the lucky hit chance to immobilize enemies for 2 seconds, and we want the aspect of grasping veins. We can actually proc a lot more damage this way. Then for our pants, we want the unique Blood Moon breeches. This is going to give us max life damage reduction and +3 to all our curse skills, as well as +3 to amplified damage, which helps us deal increased critical strike damage, and it makes your minions have a chance to curse enemies, and enemies affected by at least 1 curse take increased overpower damage, which scales very nicely with our big hits. Then for our boots, we want essence per second. One thing you have to have for essence generation: movement speed, as well as ranks to Bone Spirit. Now the Bone Spirit ranks ideally need to be GA'd, so you get the most ranks and more damage. And then also masterwork, because the more you masterwork it, you can see if we masterwork and hit this twice, we're going to go up to a +7 to Bone Spirit, meaning again even more damage. And you want to put movement speed as a temper and corpse tendril size. Again, comparing that with the other corpse tendril size, we're going to hit that max 100% cap for corpse tendrils. And for your aspect, you want the aspect of Occult Dominion, so you get more skeletal warriors and skeletal mages. And then for our primary weapon, you want a two-handed scythe for more damage. You also want intelligence, max life, and overpower damage, and then a Bone Spirit damage, as well as a Bone Spirit explosion damage tempered. Now this is going to help us cap out a lot of our regular damage, as well as maxing out our Bone Spirit damage with all of our tempers. And you want the aspect of serration, basically 40% additional damage, almost non-stop. And then for our amulet, good for you guys, we're using the unique Banished Lord's Talisman, which you can find every single time you do a Duriel run, so at least you'll get one of these that should be really good. And it's going to give us critical strike chance, overpower damage, resource generation, which we need for our essence, and +3 to core skills, meaning we get another +3 to our Bone Spirit. And then also, after you spend 275 of your primary resource, or essence in this case, your next skill is guaranteed to overpower, and your critical strikes that overpower deal 60% increased damage, meaning we can get those big, huge hits, especially on boss fights, again dealing up into the 4, 5, 6 billion, maybe even up to 10 billion at some point, who knows. And then for our rings, we want intelligence, max life, and critical strike chance, again hitting that 50% critical strike chance cap, and Bone Spirit damage, as well as when you cast a macabre skill, you restore primary resource for our resource generation. And then the aspect of torment, so our critical strikes with bone skills increase our essence generation for 4 seconds. And then our other ring is the Requiem aspect, so you gain 7% maximum essence per active minion, so we can generate quite a bit again non-stop with this. And intelligence, max life, and crit strike chance, as well as Bone Spirit damage, and again restoring our primary resource with casting a macabre skill. And then finally for our focus, we want intelligence, max life, and again maximum resource to up our maximum resource pool, since we're generating so much already, and increase our damage even more, as well as Bone Spirit damage and Bone Spirit explosion size, again to max out our Bone Spirit size at close to 100%. And then we want Edge Master's aspect, which will be proccing non-stop to deal basically 20% increased damage if you have primary resource, which we at this point are stacking to the absolute moon. Next, for our Book of the Dead, for skeletal warriors, you're going to want the second option under Reapers, so that you have a 15% chance to carve the flesh off of enemies. Helps us for corpse generation all over the place. Then we want skeletal Skeletal Mage is the first option for increased damage from each active Shadow Mage. And then finally from our Golem, we actually want the third option, so you deal 35% increased critical strike damage, but you lose the ability to actually summon a Golem. Having these, we lose some summoning ability, but max out our actual damage production. Next, I'm going to go over the Paragon board really quickly. So for our first board, you want the control glyph slotted. This is going to give us extra damage to crowd controlled enemies. We're going to take these rare nodes for damage and extra max life to sustain the build, as well as resistance as max life down here, and more damage and damage to controlled enemies to stack that even higher. Then we want to take for our second board the Bone Graft board. This particular node makes hitting enemies with bone skills increase your damage and your max essence, so that way you can stack up to 8% increased damage. Again, remember, the more essence we have, the more damage we're doing. And then we'll take the essence glyph here to increase our critical strike damage, as well as critical strikes deal 22% increased damage to enemies that are not healthy, again stacking even more damage, as well as the tenacity node up here with the max life nodes, and also the bone critical strike chance. Again, with stacking enough of these, we're going to be able to hit that maximum 100%, even by only having 50% on our actual character. Now you want the extra maximum essence nodes here, as well as the essence on kill. Then we're going to take the Flesh Eater board, so when you consume 5 corpses, it grants you 40% increased damage. And then we want the corporal glyph slotted here, so that way we get extra bonuses to all of our nodes near us, and you and your minions deal 10% increased physical damage and get additional movement speed for each active minion. Again, we want to make sure we take the rare nodes here for resistances again, so we don't have to worry much about that, and then damage to elites. Then for our next board, we're going to come over here and take the Cult Leader board. We want to slot in the Dead Razor glyph, so we get, again, those extra node bonuses around us. And then whenever your minions deal damage to an enemy, that enemy actually takes increased damage from you up to 15%. And you want to take the damage reduction for minions node over here, as well as the extra summoning damage up here. Then we want to go and slot into the Bloodbath board. The Bloodbath node is going to give us increased overpower damage for our big overpower hits that are going to be the huge billion hits that we're going to see on bosses and enemies. Now we want to slot the Gravekeeper glyph, so we get, again, those extra bonuses to nodes, as well as you deal 3% increased damage up to 18% for every close corpse, which will be proccing and maxing out all of the time. We also want extra damage while fortified and max life nodes to help sustain the build, and again, damage while fortified and intelligence in some of those nodes over here. Next, we'll go into the Scent of Death board. So with at least 2 corpses nearby, you gain 15% damage reduction. With no corpses nearby, you get 15% increased damage. It's a win-win regardless, but basically this will guarantee us non-stop free DR. And then we want the Dominate glyph, so we get, again, extra overpower damage for those big nuclear hits, for those gigantic billion damage hits. And also, when you overpower an enemy, all the damage they take from you and your minions is actually increased for 5 seconds, allowing you to continue to dish out even more damage. And then we want the Blood Baguettes board, and we want to slot the Amplify glyph here, giving us, again, bonuses to nodes, as well as enemies affected by curse skills take 10% increased damage from you and your minions, being another great damage glyph. Then we want to take the Blood Empowered rare node, as well as the other node down here. That's your Paragon board. If you follow that to the T, as long as you can keep the essence regeneration up, you will be demolishing people with massive amounts of damage as a Necromancer. So basically, the ideal rotation, basically we can start off 2 ways. We can use Blood Mist to drop a corpse on the ground because we need an initial corpse to work with. Or what we can do is use Bone Prison on an enemy, and then use Bone Spirit to basically one-shot that enemy, to then drop a corpse and then start our rotation with Corpse Tendrils. But you do want to get a corpse first so you can maximize the efficiency and damage of the build. Next, as needed, you want to continue to cast Decrepify to stack Decrepify on these enemies to, again, slow them and get the buffs that come along with Decrepify as you curse them all, essentially allowing us to do more damage. Once you get a corpse on the ground, continue spamming Corpse Tendril until you successfully cast it and bring all the enemies on the screen into one big group. Once you bring them all into one big group, that's when you truly just begin the easy rotation of using Bone Prison around the enemies, again, trapping them in and giving you additional buffs for damage. And that allows you to then use Bone Prison and trap all of those enemies that are grouped tightly together. And again, you also get a couple good things from that. Enemies that are trapped, again, allow you to continue to regain your essence very quickly, so that way you don't run out, but it also does make all those enemies vulnerable for 8 seconds, meaning you can just deal massive amounts of damage to them while they're trapped. Now, once we've trapped everyone with Bone Prison, we're then going to cast Bone Spirit. And once our Bone Spirit goes in and hits the big group of enemies, it should hit them for hundreds of millions, if not billions of damage at a time. And the best thing about this build is once Bone Spirit hits, the way its modifiers work is if it critically strikes, it can reduce its own cooldown essentially, as well as the reduced cooldowns from constantly casting Decrepify. Once you hit a big group of enemies with Bone Spirit, it can essentially reduce its entire cooldown almost all the way, allowing you to basically cast Bone Spirit again and just keep demolishing enemies with 100 million or billion damage hits. Again, continuing to cast Decrepify on enemies when needed, as well as re-trap enemies again with Bone Spirit, since your cooldown reduction should come up much quicker than what Bone Prison actually takes to go away and allow enemies to re-escape. Again, you can continue to cast corpse tendrils to keep enemies tightly grouped if needed, and again also making them vulnerable, but for the most part, keeping enemies consistently trapped in bone prison will result in them basically being vulnerable indefinitely at that point. Now keep in mind, while you're doing all of this, you want to make sure you're using your Erase Skeleton ability, consistently spamming to summon your skeletons, because again, we want to proc that Flesh Eater Paragon node, so we're upping our damage by plus 40%. So while you're doing all this, make sure you're constantly also spamming your skeleton ability, because that's going to again proc us for even more damage. Cast your corpse tendrils, use Bone Spirit, decrepify all of the enemies you can, and while they're still in the group, hit them with Bone Prison, then continue to spam your Summon Skeleton to proc our Flesh Eater extra 40% damage buff. Use Decrepify again to keep enemies cursed. Continue summoning your skeletons to keep that Flesh Eater proc up and alive. Use Bone Spirit again every single time it's up for those big damage hits. At this point, cast Corpse Tendrils and Bone Prison again to make sure all those enemies are tightly grouped, and again actively trapped inside Bone Prison for all the buffs you get. Decrepify them, summon skeletons, and continue to cast Bone Spirit when it's up. So basically the idea is to keep enemies trapped, get all those buffs, summon your skeletons constantly for the extra 40% damage buff, decrepify them to keep them cursed, and just continue to never let them go. And once you trap all the enemies on the screen in this Bone Prison, there's essentially nothing they can do to you, making this build almost invincible in a lot of cases. And again, check out the links in the description. Make sure you check out both those build planners, as well as follow Necro on YouTube, because again, he is the Necromancer King. That being said, if this video helped you out, drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next one.